9 minutes after 7 o'clock, we're inside hour number 2 of the Breakfast Roundtable. Thank you very much, Sherwin Gardner, for helping us get things started with Go Tell It. And speaking of Go Tell It, the Attorney General told the nation that he is going to be gunning for those who are involved in corruption. And the big question we have to wonder is, or get the answer to is, how many of the former administration may be within the sights of his telescopic rifle to help us glean some more. We have on the line with us attorney at law and a member of the Police Service Commission, Martin George. Good morning to you, Martin George.
Hi, good morning to you, Jessie.
Good morning,
and
Mr.
good
George.
morning to you, Dr. Wayne, and good morning, Eddison, and good morning to your listeners.
Martin George, when you heard the statements from the Attorney General, what was your first thought?
Well, it's not surprising because the point is part of the role of the Attorney General is to basically be the vanguard and defender of the state and the state's assets and, resources. So in that sense, if it is that there is evidence to show that there's been some malfeasance, in terms of the frittering away of the assets of the state through deliberate acts of corruption, then of course that falls squarely within the purview of the Attorney General's office. However, from the statement I heard, I didn't hear too many details, so I would imagine that there are investigations that are going to be undertaken, and then I guess we would be, furnished with some more of the, details as to, what exactly he's alluding to and who exactly he's, looking to go after in that regard. And the thing is, we have to understand as a nation that we really must try to move to a point where we eliminate the opportunities and occurrences of corruption up front, rather than, doing this kind of, playing catch up after the horse has bolted. I mean, we've had, examples from as far back as, the days of the, Gene Miles and the gas station racket, in Trinidad and Tobago, where, we always seem to be, going after the event has occurred. So I think we need to really look at our structures of governance, our structures of, administration to ensure that we put systems and procedures in place to try to reduce or minimize the occurrences of graft, bribe, corruption officially that occur in the country.
Mr. George, post any election in Trinidad and Tobago, you just mentioned Gene Miles, there are always allegations of corruption and so on, but nobody has ever been arrested, as the case might be. How does one, let's say that the Attorney General, get justiciable, I think that's a good word, evidence to secure some kind of arrest and prosecution? Would he have to speak to the PS, as the case might be? Who would he have to speak to? It sounds, almost intractable to bring somebody like that to book in the courts.
Well, the thing is, it's usually a scenario where you have a whistleblower. That's usually the most certain way to ensure that you have, as you say, justiciable evidence that you can go forward with, because otherwise it's sometimes difficult, because persons, I would imagine, would use several layers to either disguise
Yes.
or cover the acts of corruption. So I think unless you have somebody who was definitely there and would have had access to the documentation or exactly what went on, then it's difficult to make the connection and then to actually have a case that you can prosecute in court. Because remember, in a criminal prosecution, the burden of proof relies on you. The defendant doesn't have to prove a thing, So you have to do all the work to prove that this person was guilty of this offense. And then, you may not just need to show that, look, monies were paid, but you then also need to show that they were received, that kind of thing. So it is difficult, I agree, but it's not impossible. And as I say, I mean, while this is important, I would really like to see that we can move to a position sometime in the future where we try to eliminate it at source, rather than trying to, put a plaster on the wound afterwards.
Martin George, we have several instruments and tools at our disposal when it comes to dealing with issues of corruption. We have the Integrity Commission. We have
the Prevention of Corruption Act.
That's right. We also have the Financial Intelligence Unit. We have the Proceeds Against Crime Act, rather.
Yeah.
We have all of these different tools and instruments. But how effective have they been? They haven't really been that effective, have they? Or is it that they just have not been used for us to see exactly how effective they can be?
Well, let's not forget that the Integrity in Public Life Act has been implemented against former Prime Minister Basdeo Pandey in relation to the allegation and charge that he's facing in relation to the failure to declare a bank account, which was alleged to be in London. Mm-hmm. So, it has been used that way. But the point is, I think the Integrity Commission itself has suffered several, false starts, as it went along. You recall the scenario with Dr. Keith Rowley, whereby they eventually had to withdraw everything, and then they lost in court, even on the judicial review application that he filed, So I think they've had their challenges and difficulties too. And I have said repeatedly that we need to look at the entire Integrity Commission and have it restructured. Because, first of all, as I said, we need to remove the word integrity from the framework and makeup of that commission and simply make it an anti-corruption commission, because you will then be more direct and more focused in your task. Because when you say integrity, it becomes such a nebulous concept as to what is integrity for one person may not be integrity for another. And then, you get into all kinds of gray areas once you are dealing with integrity as your lead word or lead defining, statement of your mission. But if you say anti-corruption, then it's much easier to focus and target specific acts. Then you could probably then push for more focused legislation, which would probably deal with, specific things. You could have things that, deal with, say, for instance, the licensing authority. We know that things are alleged to be occurring there all the time. So then maybe you could have specific sections dealing with that, and you say, look, if it is that, it is, you make it a specific offense that, if someone is, paying, a fee illegally to receive some favor or benefit from an officer of the licensing and transport division, then, you set out penalties and stuff like that. So the Anti-Corruption Commission then now is able to be a lot more focused and target specific in that regard, as opposed to an Integrity Commission.
Mr. George, I'm glad you raised that point about the target and bringing into the fray the licensing officers, because I was thinking this statement by the AG, was it just targeting the former government MPs, as it were, members of the cabinet, or it's an all-inclusive? And also, perhaps this is two-pronged in nature, to warn or ward off any temptation by his colleagues, PNM might say his colleagues, from yielding to these temptations, correct?
Well, I would hope that it is the latter, in that it is the more all-inclusive approach, because you would recall that he did go on to guard his comments to say that it is not a witch hunt. So therefore, I would imagine, it could not only be focused on persons from the former regime or politicians from the former governing party. So therefore, I would think that it is a broader-based scenario, and I think he would also be looking at state enterprises, if I'm not mistaken, where it seemed that there were persons within those state enterprises, either at the level of the board or, upper executives, who engaged in practices which clearly can be justiciable, to use your terminology, which can be brought to the court by way of some charges or, some, call into account for their actions, even if it is to, make them pay back the monies that have been spent illegally. Because remember, as a director on a state board, you have certain fiduciary duties. You are accountable for the monies you spend. You would recall the former government, they tried to bring actions against the directors of ETEC, if you recall, in the bamboo networks matter. They also tried to bring, in relation to the guest house up at UTT with the Reverend Payner. I mean, of course, that second one was not successful because the evidence just wasn't there. But the point is, it shows that you can be held accountable even if you are sitting on a state board, if it is that you have been either wittingly or unwittingly participating in decisions which cause the deliberate loss of state assets through corruption.
Martin George, I want to go back to the point that you made that this is not supposed to look like, sound like, or feel like a witch hunt. But because we have no history really of bringing politicians and former administrations to book for corrupt activities which may have taken place under their watch, it's gonna look like, feel like, and sound like a witch hunt.
Well, as I said, if it is that it's limited only to the politicians, then of course I can't.
Even if they are included in the great wash that is the Attorney General has promised, they are still going to use that kind of terminology to say that it's a witch hunt and that everybody else is just window dressing to make it look as though it's not a witch hunt.
Well, I mean, the point is, I mean, you're talking about politicians. So, I mean, of course, remember, a politician looks out for a politician. That's their job number one as far as they see it, you know. So, of course, they would give that explanation because they would want to say, well, look, you know, we are being targeted, you know, etc. But the point is, let's not forget that in terms of, say, for instance, if we were to look back at the history of the UNC, the legislation which actually became the undoing of the UNC was actually legislation that was implemented by the UNC. You know, you recall that former Attorney General Lawrence Marach, he's the one who piloted those bills and brought the legislation to Parliament. The members of Parliament voted for it, including the then UNC under Basdeo Pandey, and it's part of that same legislation that ensnared Mr. Pandey himself. You know, subsequently. So, you know, the point is we have to be mature enough to understand that there are certain decisions we have to take for the good of the nation, regardless of how persons may view it or skew it. So I would think that in such a circumstance, it is the duty and responsibility of any Attorney General, once he's been fair and objective, to pursue such matters and basically let the chips fall where they may. It is not supposed to be specific and targeted only to your political opponents. Then that would clearly be an abuse of your own office as Attorney General. As yet, I have no evidence to suggest that that is what it would be. So I would still like to give the benefit of the doubt and assume that it's going to be a broader-based approach, which would be much more all-encompassing and not specifically targeting only persons from the former regime.
You know, looking, Mr. George, looking at the possible success of anything like that in the courts, as the case might be, you know, the permanent secretary is supposed to be the CIO of a particular ministry and so on. But the thing is, if he accedes to the demands of the minister and does something that may not be really proper, as the case might be, who takes the blame? Even though the CEO, the PS is the man in charge there. But if he said, well, I was simply complying with the demands of the minister, as the case might be, and sometimes ministers change from one ministry to the next, because there's a story in today's Guardian where Vasant Bharat was being asked a question about somebody misusing funds from the ADB, and he was the line minister at the time, and so on. You know, so it is so complicated that, you know, who do we charge in a case like this?
I could tell you, Eddison, when you look at the way the public service has been set up and structured, the permanent secretaries, I will tell you, they are actually generally more powerful than the minister in terms of administratively. A minister may give a directive, but permanent secretaries, they function by rules, regulations, they have everything laid out in terms of their protocols and procedures. So, notwithstanding a directive may come from a minister, if you are a good, diligent, and honest permanent secretary, then all you simply do is you refer the minister. You say, Honorable Minister, I have received your directive. However, by circular so and memo number, so we follow this protocol and this procedure. So in the circumstances, we would prefer to adhere to that. And that certainly covers you as the permanent secretary. So I have seen many instances where permanent secretaries have basically bucked the wishes of ministers by simply drawing their attention to the regulations. And they said, well, look, hey, if you want this done, then this is the procedure we follow. Plain and simple. And no minister can, take any legal action against a permanent secretary if the permanent secretary is simply following the rules and guidelines in that regard. If the permanent secretary chooses to, be, disloyal to his office, then that's a different thing. But I think by and large, our permanent secretaries and the senior members of the public service, I think they have actually been a good bulwark in many instances against some of the excesses. They may not have been able to stop everything, but I certainly think that many of the excesses they've been able to stop. And I'll tell you something. If you look back to the history of Trinidad and Tobago, the onset of the major instances of corruption within recent time have been through the special purpose companies. That has been the cause of it. If everything was still going through the public service, trust me, we could never have the levels of graft and corruption that you hear being bandied about. But it's when you circumvent those and you set up the UDICOT, the NIDCO, the RUDICOT, all these special purpose companies which, are outside the direct ambit and control of the permanent secretaries and the public service rules, guidelines, strictures, and procedures. That is where you open the floodgates for massive and wanton corruption.
We're speaking with Martin George, a senior attorney at law and member of the Police Service Commission, looking at the implications of the Attorney General's promise to go after corruption during his tenure. Martin George, we've got a caller who wants to join the conversation. Hello, good morning.
Hello, good morning again.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Mr. George, good morning to you, sir.
Yeah, hi, good morning, sir.
Mr. George, you spoke about the former Prime Minister, Basdi Pandey, being brought to court on the matter of the $10 million in London. But there are a number of former ministers who some of them are out on bail at this time, and I don't know whatever happened to those cases. I remember names like Finbar Ganga, then there was Sadiq Baksh, then they spoke about Brian Kwaitong and people like that. They're all former ministers. I don't know whatever happened to those cases, but the thing about it, though, I remember before getting there, even Dr. Tim Gopi Singh, when he was minister, was hauled before the courts on malfeasance charges and so on. So they do bring these people to court at times, and it's more damaging, I think, at times. You have to have your name smeared than being given a jail sentence or something. Don't you agree? Thank you.
Very good point. The caller is quite correct in terms of what he has mentioned there.
Let's get another call in quickly before we let you go. Hello, good morning.
A very good morning to you, Jessie.
Good morning, Mr. Santa Cruz.
And to Mr. Carr.
Morning.
And to Dr. Wayne.
Sir.
Good morning, Mr. George.
Hi, good morning.
Mr. George, the language that the Attorney General used to go after corrupt people and corruption was somewhat, to me, exclusive language, and that was to avoid people from saying that it's a witch hunt. But whereas, in fact, to me, it is a witch hunt. The other thing is, earlier in your conversation, you said money paid but not received. How do you explain that? Thank you.
Okay, you can show money moving from one account out. But the point is, if you want to have somebody indicted for the act of the corruption, then you must also show that that person actually received it. Because in other words, it may pass through several intermediaries before it gets to the person who is actually the architect behind the corruption. So it's not just a question of showing that the money did move from this person's account, but it also must move to the account of the ultimate person that you're targeting as the one you are alleging the corruption. So that's what I meant in terms of that. Because the point is you just using as an example, in the FIFA investigation, you saw how the U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch, how she laid out a series of multi-layered transactions passing through several different dummy corporations, dummy accounts, and different islands, going through Caymans, going through different banks and stuff like that. So the point is, things are used that way to disguise the tracks. So therefore, it's not just sufficient to show that, look, the money was paid out as a bribe, but you also have to trace it to show that it was ultimately received, because in fact I think she eventually pointed to some monies local banks here in Trinidad and Tobago,
that's right,
ultimately ending up here. So that's the point I was making in that regard. And as to the first point the caller made, I don't have a crystal ball in terms of the wishes or intentions of the Attorney General, so I have to make my assessment based on what the words he used, and from those words, I cannot, with respect, form the same conclusion that the caller made. I would still give the benefit of the doubt and say, look, I assume that this is going to be all-embracing and not an attempt at a witch hunt.
Mr. George, rooting out corruption in state agencies and institutions, according to the AG, that's a monumental task. When you consider corruption is like endemic, it's a second nature in Trinidad. It's a part of the system.
It's part of the culture, unfortunately, and I think that is where the challenge starts, because we must start a campaign of re-education of our population. And I am very serious when I speak of that, because in other words, we must actually start teaching our people that, look, this is not good, it is correct, it is not acceptable. Not just from a criminal sanction perspective, but also from a moral, ethical, and a nation-building perspective. It seems that we've lost focus on that, and everyone has felt, well, look, I have to jump on the gravy train too, because everybody else is doing it. So I think that there has to be a realignment of our social consciousness, the ethos and fabric of our our national pride and our nation building efforts. But then, of course, the example has to be shown by our leaders, and that's where the problem has always been. If the leaders are not showing that example, then of course the citizens are not going to take them seriously if they're mouthing the phrases and saying, do as I say, but not as I do. So the challenge is really on this new government. If it is that they are going to walk the talk, then they have to lead by example and show that, look, hey, we are setting a different standard. We are raising the bar. And of course, that's quite a challenge in itself, because as I say, we've grown accustomed to the corruption. So they will really have to distinguish themselves in this scenario and show that, look, they are taking a definitely different level. And therefore, I think they can then start to speak to the nation and say, hey, listen, everyone must fall in line and follow suit.
Martin George, we want to thank you for having breakfast with the Breakfast Roundtable this morning. And we look forward to chatting with you again soon.
I think mine was a virtual breakfast. It was quite tasty nonetheless. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.
Okay, great. Same to you guys.
Thank you.
Martin George, a senior attorney at law and a member of the Police Service Commission, here on the Breakfast Roundtable.
Don't touch a button. We'll be right back with more on Sky 99.